The forged signature glares up at me. 50 million reasons Marcus wants me dead by sunrise. My hands shake as I jam the thumb drive into the port, downloading the only proof of his theft. Security's boots pound the hallway. Closer, closer. The trophy in my grip is my last weapon. One wrong move, and I'm erased. Sarah's empty office hits harder than any bullet. The note in her desk reads like a death sentence. She's been selling me out for months. The woman I trusted to save me just signed my execution order. Nowhere's safe. No one's clean. And the drive in my pocket? It's either my salvation or my coffin. The heavy scent of cedar and expensive scotch clung to the walls of the study. A thick, suffocating layer of wealth that felt more like a shroud than a luxury. Julian Vance pressed his thumb against the paper, tracing the ink of Marcus Thorne's signature. The loop of the M broke with a microscopic tremor, a jagged giveaway no laser printer could replicate. $50 million rested on this lie. This wasn't just a document. It was a death warrant signed in cursive. Julian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a trapped bird seeking exit. He knew the math of this room, the geometry of the betrayal. Marcus hadn't just forged a signature. He had architected a vacuum where Julian's life used to be. Sweat pricked Julian's hairline, cold and stinging. He slid the insurance policy aside, revealing the ledger beneath. His fingers fumbled with the silver thumb drive, slotting it into the desktop port with a metallic click that sounded like a hammer cocking in the silence. The screen glowed, a pale blue light that washed over his face, highlighting the desperation in his eyes. He began the transfer, watching the progress bar crawl with agonizing slowness. Every byte was a nail in Marcus's coffin, a digital trail of shell companies, laundered premiums, and names of senators buried in spreadsheets. This was the map of a ghost empire, and Julian was the only one with the compass. The firewall is breathing down your neck, Julian. 3 minutes. David's voice crackled through the earpiece. It was thin, distorted by the layers of interference, but the urgency was unmistakable. David was the only variable Julian hadn't fully quantified. A man who smelled of stale cigarettes and spoke in the hushed tones of a shadow. "I see the offshore accounts," Julian whispered, his gaze locked on the monitor. "Singapore, the Cayman accounts. It's all here." He tapped a restless rhythm against the mahogany desk. 1, 2, 3, 4. He needed the count to stay sane. The cooling fan of the computer whirred, a mechanical panting that mirrored his own shallow breaths. "Pick up the pace," David hissed. Security just cleared the lobby elevator. "They aren't taking the stairs, Julian. They're coming straight for the penthouse." Julian ignored the phantom itch in his collar. He watched the final folder labeled Project Phoenix Transfer. The green light on the drive blinked like a frantic heartbeat. He snatched the plastic stick from the slot the second the display flickered white. Outside, the muffled chime of the elevator echoed down the marble corridor, a silver bell announcing the end of the world. Julian tucked the drive into his inner pocket, the weight of the plastic pressing against his ribs like a loaded gun. He smoothed the insurance papers, aligning the edges with surgical precision, leaving the room exactly as he found it. A monument to a crime, hidden in plain sight. "Exit via the north balcony," David commanded, his voice a sandpaper rasp in Julian's ear. "I've bypassed the magnetic lock on the service door. You have exactly 45 seconds before the hallway cameras cycle back to your position." Julian didn't argue. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who counted every step. 1, 2, 3. The plush carpet muffled his footfalls, but the silence of the suite felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were watching. He reached the heavy glass door to the balcony, the cold metal of the handle biting into his palm. He squeezed, and the mechanism yielded with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The Chicago air rushed in, a sudden assault of exhaust fumes and lake-effect wind that tasted of iron and winter. He stepped out onto the narrow stone ledge, 40 stories above the grid of the city. Below, the streetlights flickered in their unnatural, rapid pulse, a sea of red and green eyes staring up at him. The wind shrieked between the towers, a high-pitched wail that threatened to pull the breath from his lungs. He didn't look down. Looking down meant calculating the velocity of a fall, and that was a number he wasn't ready to face. "I'm at the service door," Julian breathed, his voice whipped away by the gale. He reached the heavy steel door at the end of the terrace. He pressed his shoulder against it, and for a terrifying second, it held. Then, the electronic lock chirped, a small, victorious sound, and the door swung inward. He tumbled into the service stairwell, the smell of industrial cleaner and dust hitting him like a physical blow. The door clicked shut behind him, severing the connection to the wind. He was in the guts of the building now, the concrete throat where the help and the ghosts moved. "Start climbing down, Julian," David said. "And don't stop until you hit the basement. I'm looping the feed for the next 3 minutes. But after that, you're a ghost in a machine that's waking up." Julian began the descent. 1, 2, 3. He counted the stairs out loud, his voice a low murmur in the echoing concrete shaft. If he lost count, the world would tilt. If he lost count, Marcus would win. He reached the 10th floor, his lungs burning, the metallic tang of adrenaline coating the back of his throat. His knees vibrated with every impact against the gray cement. Suddenly, a heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards above him, the sound of a door being kicked open. Voices, sharp and barking, filtered down the stairwell. "He's in the shaft. Move!" The hunt had moved from the digital to the physical. Julian didn't panic. He recalculated. He swung over the railing, dropping the last 5 feet to the next landing with a bone-jarring thud. He didn't stop to check for injury. He burst through the door labeled Executive Lounge, a space of velvet chairs and false comfort that now felt like a cage. The room was bathed in the amber glow of low-hanging lamps. It smelled of expensive tobacco and the ghost of 1,000 lies told over crystal tumblers. Julian sprinted across the polished floor, his reflection ghosting across the dark wood panels. "Julian, stop!" a voice boomed. He skidded to a halt. Standing by the bar was a man in a charcoal suit, his face a mask of professional indifference. One of Marcus's personal hounds. The guard didn't draw a weapon. He simply adjusted his cuffs, a gesture Julian recognized as a prelude to violence. "Give me the drive, Mr. Vance. We can make this look like a misunderstanding." Julian's gaze darted to the side. On a marble pedestal sat a heavy bronze award, a stylized eagle with wings spread. He didn't think. He reacted. He lunged, his fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy base of the trophy. As the guard moved in, Julian swung with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. The bronze connected with the guard's temple with a sickening, dull thud. The man crumpled, his head hitting the edge of a mahogany table before he slumped to the floor. Julian stood over him, chest heaving, the trophy still clutched in his shaking hand. The silence of the lounge was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He dropped the eagle, the metal clanging against the floor like a funeral bell. "I'm out," Julian whispered into the earpiece. "I'm heading for the service entrance." "Go," David urged. "The alleyway is clear for now. Get to Sarah's. She's the only one who can file the injunction before the board meets." Julian burst through the service exit and into the biting cold of the Chicago night. The alley smelled of wet cardboard and old grease. He didn't look back at the tower of glass and steel he had just escaped. He ran, his shoes slapping against the damp pavement, heading toward the only person he still believed was on his side. The city moved around him like a predator, the sirens wailing in the distance like a warning he had ignored for too long. He reached the brick facade of Sarah Johnson's law office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The brass plate on the door was polished, reflecting the sickly yellow of the streetlights. He hammered on the glass, the vibration traveling up his arm. "Sarah, open up!" There was no answer. The lobby was dark, the only light coming from a flickering computer monitor behind the reception desk. Julian felt a cold prickle of unease. He reached for the handle, and to his surprise, the door was unlocked. It swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The air inside smelled of bleach, sharp, chemical, and overwhelming. It was the smell of a crime scene being scrubbed before the blood was even dry. Julian moved through the shadows, his eyes scanning the sterile white walls. "Sarah?" He reached her private office. The door was ajar. He pushed it open and saw the room had been tossed. Files scattered like fallen leaves, a chair overturned. But his eyes were drawn to the desk. In the center of the blotter, perfectly aligned with the edges of the leather, sat a single sheet of paper. Julian stepped forward, his heart slowing into a heavy, leaden thud. He picked up the note. It wasn't a legal document. It was a ledger entry, written in Sarah's precise, elegant hand. It listed dates, amounts, and a single name repeated in the margin: Thorne. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Subverted. Julian had come here for sanctuary, believing Sarah was his last line of defense. He had shared every secret, every coordinate of his financial life with her, thinking her questions were the mark of a thorough, legal mind. He looked at the paper again. The dates went back 3 years. Every time he had asked her to audit a deal, she had been reporting back to Marcus. She wasn't his shield. She was the architect of the very trap he was currently caught in. He felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had handed her the keys to his kingdom, and she had sold them for a partnership in a shell company that didn't even exist. He noticed a small detail: a coffee mug on the desk, still warm, with a smudge of lipstick on the rim. She had been here minutes ago. She had left this note for him to find, a final taunt before she vanished into Marcus's shadow. The weight of the betrayal was a physical pressure in his chest, making it hard to draw air. He wasn't just a man on the run anymore. He was a man who had been erased by the people he trusted most. The drive in his pocket felt heavier than ever, a piece of plastic that was now the only thing keeping him tethered to the world of the living. "David," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "She's gone. Sarah. She was with him the whole time." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Only the faint, rhythmic sound of David breathing. And then, the soft, trembling sound of a man tracing a grocery list in the dark. "Then the math has changed, Julian," David finally said, his voice colder than the Chicago wind. "You aren't fighting for your career anymore. You're fighting for your life. Get out of there, now." Julian turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he saw the reflection in the glass partition. A black SUV had just pulled up to the curb outside. The headlights cut through the darkness of the office like twin searchlights. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, and the city was closing its jaws. The television in the corner of a nearby electronics shop window flickered to life as Julian crouched in the shadows of an alleyway. Marcus Thorne's face filled the screen, broad, tanned, and radiating a predatory confidence. He was standing behind a podium emblazoned with the firm's logo, his dark eyes fixed on the cameras with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the glass. "It is with a heavy heart," Marcus began, his voice a low, prowling drawl that vibrated through the cheap speakers of the display units, "that I must announce a grave breach of trust within our family. Julian Vance, a man I considered a brother, has disappeared following the discovery of a $50 million shortfall in our pension funds." Julian watched, his jaw tightening until it ached. Marcus reached up and cracked his left pinky, pop, then the ring finger, pop, the Thorne pop, the celebration of a lie. "We are working closely with the authorities," Marcus continued, leaning into the microphone to create a false sense of intimacy with the viewing public. "Julian, if you're listening, come in. Don't make this worse. We can resolve this together." "Together," Julian spat, the word tasting like copper. "The board of directors has called an emergency session," Marcus added, his smile never reaching his eyes. "In exactly 6 hours, we will vote to revoke Mr. Vance's standing and move for a full criminal indictment. We will not let one man's greed destroy the futures of our employees." Julian checked his watch. The digital numbers pulsed. 10 p.m. He had until 4 a.m. before he became a ghost with a warrant. He needed to move, but the city felt like it was shrinking. Every street lamp was a spotlight, every pedestrian a potential informant. "David, did you hear that?" Julian asked, pressing the earpiece into his ear. "I heard," David replied. "He's painting the target on your back in neon. My safe house in Lincoln Park is still clean. Get there. I've got a car stashed 2 blocks north of your current position. A gray sedan, plates ending in 4-2. The keys are under the wheel well." Julian moved through the shadows, counting the paces. 34, 35. He reached the sedan. His fingers grazed the cold, oily underside of the tire until he felt the magnetic key box. He slid into the driver's seat, the interior smelling of vanilla air freshener and old upholstery. He turned the engine over, the low rumble of the motor a small comfort in the oppressive silence. He drove with his eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The Chicago skyline loomed over him, a jagged wall of light and glass. As he turned onto a quieter residential street, he saw it. A black SUV, idling at a stoplight 3 cars back. It didn't have a front plate. It didn't have its lights on. It was just a void in the traffic. "I've got company," Julian said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Lose them," David commanded. "If they follow you to the safe house, the game is over before it starts." Julian floored it, the sedan's engine screaming in protest. He swerved through a yellow light, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The SUV didn't hesitate. It lurched forward, weaving through traffic with a terrifying, synchronized precision. Julian took a sharp right, then a left, diving into the labyrinth of side streets near the lake. The pursuit was a blur of neon and shadow. Julian's heart was a drum, beating out a frantic rhythm. He saw an opening, a narrow alleyway between 2 brick warehouses. He yanked the wheel, the sedan fishtailing as it slid into the darkness. He killed the lights and slammed on the brakes, the car coming to a halt amidst a pile of discarded crates. He sat in the dark, his breath hitching in his throat. Seconds passed. Then, the low hum of a powerful engine drifted past the mouth of the alley. The black SUV glided by, a predatory shadow searching for its kill. Julian waited until the sound faded into the distance, before he let out a shuddering breath. "I lost them," he whispered. "Good. Now get to the house. I'm already inside. The safe house was a nondescript brownstone with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Julian climbed the stairs, 1, 2, 3, and pushed through the door. The interior was dim, lit only by the glow of a dozen monitors stacked on a folding table. David sat in the center of the room, his grease-streaked hair falling over his eyes as he stared at a scrap of paper. "You're late," David said without looking up. He was tracing the words on a grocery list with a trembling finger. 1 gallon whole milk. His lips moved silently, a prayer to a dead woman. "The city is crawling with Marcus's people," Julian said, collapsing into a chair that smelled of stale cigarettes. "He's frozen my accounts. I tried to use my card at a gas station, declined. My phone is a brick." David finally looked at him, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Of course he did. He's cutting the oxygen, Julian. He wants you gasping for air so you'll make a mistake. He wants you to run." "I am running," Julian snapped. "But I have the drive. If I can get this to the board." "The board won't listen to a fugitive," David interrupted, his voice a harsh rasp. "You need a stage. You need to hit him where he can't hide." Julian leaned back, his eyes tracking the flicker of the monitors. "The gala. The charity event at the remote estate tomorrow night. Every major investor, the DA, the press, they'll all be there." "It's a fortress," David noted, cracking a knuckle. "Marcus's personal security, plus the estate's own detail. You go in there, you're walking into the lion's den with a stake tied around your neck." "It's the only way," Julian insisted. "He'll be forced to maintain the image. He can't kill me in front of 100 witnesses." David stared at him for a long moment, then reached into his trench coat and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. He smoothed it on the table with a slow, deliberate motion. "I was an investigator once, Julian. Before Marcus took my badge and my life. I know how he thinks. He doesn't just want to win. He wants to watch you realize you've lost." Julian looked at the monitors. One of them showed a live feed of the Millennium Park parking garage. A man on a motorcycle was idling by the exit, his helmeted head turning slowly from side to side. "Who was that?" Julian asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "That," David said, "is Christopher Brown. He's the hammer, and Marcus just dropped him." The next morning, the air in Chicago was thick with the smell of impending rain, a metallic, heavy scent that made the skin itch. Julian stood in the shadows of the Millennium Park parking garage, his breath misting in the cold. He was holding his laptop bag tight against his side, the weight of the stolen files a physical burden. "He's on the 3rd level." David's voice crackled. "Move toward the elevators, but don't take them. Use the ramp." Julian started to move, but the sound of a high-revving engine echoed through the concrete cavern. A motorcycle burst around the corner, its headlight a piercing eye in the gloom. The rider was dressed in all black, his movements fluid and robotic. "Go! Move!" David shouted. Julian bolted. He sprinted down the concrete ramp, his shoes skidding on the oily surface. The motorcycle roared behind him, the sound bouncing off the low ceilings, a predatory growl that grew louder with every second. Julian ducked between 2 parked SUVs, the metal hot against his palm. The motorcycle swerved, the rider leaning low as he navigated the tight turns. Julian saw the glint of a weapon, a short, matte black barrel. He dived behind a concrete pillar just as a muffled thwip sounded and a chunk of stone exploded inches from his head. "He's shooting!" Julian screamed into the earpiece. "Get to the subway station. It's 200 yards east. There's a crowd. He can't use the bike there." Julian scrambled to his feet and ran for the exit. He burst out of the garage and into the gray light of the park. The wind whipped his hair into his eyes, but he didn't slow down. He could hear the motorcycle behind him, the tires thumping over the curb. He reached the stairs to the subway, the entrance a yawning concrete mouth. He lunged down the steps, his feet barely touching the ground. Behind him, the motorcycle skidded to a halt at the top of the stairs, the rider watching him with a blank, unblinking visor. Julian didn't wait. He sprinted toward the turnstiles, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached for his bag to grab his transit card, but his fingers met only air. He froze. The laptop bag. It was gone. He must have dropped it during the struggle in the garage. "The files," Julian gasped, leaning against a tiled wall. "David, I lost the laptop." "Forget the laptop," David hissed. "The train is coming. Get on it." The roar of the Blue Line train filled the station, a deafening screech of metal on metal that vibrated through Julian's teeth. He vaulted over the turnstile, ignoring the shouts of the attendant, and threw himself through the closing doors of the car. As the train pulled away, he saw the man in black standing on the platform. The rider had removed his helmet, revealing a blank, robotic expression and a neck tattoo of a barcode. He didn't look angry. He looked patient. He pulled up his pant legs, revealing a pair of mismatched socks, one red, one blue, and pulled them tight. Julian slumped into a seat, the smell of stale air and ozone filling his lungs. He was alive, but he was empty-handed. The digital evidence was gone, and the clock was still ticking. "David," Julian said, his voice a hollow whisper. "What do I do now?" "We meet," David replied. "Behind the old cannery on 4th. There's something you need to know about who you're really working with." The alley behind the cannery was a graveyard of rusted machinery and broken glass. Julian waited in the shadows, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide the tremors. David emerged from the gloom, his trench coat billowing like a shroud. "You look like hell," David said, stopping a few feet away. "I lost everything," Julian said. "The drive is all I have left, and I don't even know if it'll be enough without the laptop to decrypt the secondary layer." David looked at him, a strange, twisted smile playing on his lips. "You think this is about the money, don't you? You think you're the hero of a story about a corporate heist?" Julian frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Marcus Thorne didn't just frame me," David said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "He destroyed the only thing I ever cared about. My wife. She died because of the chaos he created. I've spent 10 years waiting for a way to get close enough to pull the whole temple down on his head." He stepped closer, the smell of bourbon and cigarettes thick on his breath. "You aren't a partner, Julian. You're a key. I needed someone with your access, someone with your numbers to get me past the final gate. I don't care about your innocence. I don't care if you go to prison for the rest of your life." Julian felt a cold dread wash over him. "You're using me." "I'm using everyone," David said, his eyes flashing with a manic light. "And tonight, at that gala, I'm going to watch Marcus burn, even if I have to throw you into the fire to keep the flames going." He turned and walked away, leaving Julian alone in the dark. The betrayal was complete. Julian was a man without a country, without a friend, and with only a few hours left before the world decided he was a criminal. He looked down at his hands. They were steady now. The count had stopped. There was only one number left. One. One man, one drive, and one final chance to survive the night. The remote estate was a monument to paranoia masquerading as architecture. It sat on a rise overlooking the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. surrounded by a forest that seemed to lean in, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the glass. The air here was different, colder, sharper, and filled with the incessant electric drone of insects that sounded more like a wall of white noise than anything natural. Julian stepped out of the shadows of the tree line. His borrowed tuxedo felt like a costume that didn't fit. He adjusted his cufflinks, the metal edges cold against his skin. 1, 2. He forced himself to stop. The count wouldn't save him here. The driveway was a parade of black town cars and silver limousines, their headlights cutting through the mist like silent searchlights. Security guards in identical suits moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, their earpieces glowing with a faint blue light. They didn't look like men. They looked like extensions of the house itself. "Keep your head down," David's voice whispered in his ear. The connection was spotty, flickering with the interference of the estate's jamming equipment. "The invitation I got you is for a junior analyst from the New York branch. They won't recognize the face, but they'll check the credentials." Julian approached the main entrance, a massive set of oak doors that felt like the gates to a tomb. He handed his digital pass to a guard whose face was a blank mask of professional indifference. The man scanned it, the device chirping a soft, rhythmic note. "Welcome, Mr. Sterling," the guard said, his voice as cold as the stone steps. "Enjoy the evening." Julian stepped inside, and the sensory assault of the gala hit him like a physical wave. The ballroom was a swirling chaos of spinning lights and thumping bass that vibrated through the floorboards. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of 100 different perfumes, a floral weight that made it hard to breathe. He moved through the crowd of oblivious socialites, his eyes scanning for Marcus. He saw him near the center of the room, surrounded by a cluster of investors. Marcus was laughing, his head thrown back, his predatory eyes scanning the room even as he played the part of the gracious host. Julian ducked into a side corridor, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He needed the physical ledger. The digital files were a start, but the ledger was the only thing that contained the handwritten bribes to Sarah and the DA. It was the smoking gun that couldn't be deleted or encrypted. "The library is on the second floor, north wing," David instructed. "The guards cycle every 5 minutes. You have a 90-second window between the rotation of the 3rd and 4th floor details." Julian climbed the stairs. No counting this time, just speed. He reached the library doors, the heavy wood carved with scenes of ancient battles. He pressed his ear to the grain. Silence. He slipped inside, the smell of old paper and dust parching his throat. The room was sterile, the books arranged by color rather than subject, creating a rainbow that felt calculated and hollow. Julian moved to the history section. He remembered Marcus mentioning a false shelf during a late-night drinking session months ago. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books. They were all blank inside, beautiful husks of knowledge. He found the latch, a small, recessed lever behind a volume of The Rise of Empires. He pulled it, and a section of the wall slid back with a soft, pneumatic hiss. There it was, a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Julian snatched it, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. Names, dates, amounts. It was all there. Sarah Johnson, $500,000. District Attorney Miller, $1.2 million. Subverted. Julian felt a surge of triumph, a hot, electric relief that flooded his veins. He had it. This was the leverage he needed to end this. He could walk into the ballroom, present this to the federal agents he knew were lurking in the crowd, and watch Marcus's empire crumble in real time. He tucked the ledger under his arm, his mind already racing toward the exit. He could see the path clearly now, the justice, the vindication, the return to the world he knew. He felt a rare, genuine smile touch his lips. He was smart. He was capable. He had outmaneuvered the monster. He turned toward the door, his hand already reaching for the handle. But something stopped him. A sound, not a footstep, but the rhythmic, sharp pop of a knuckle being cracked. Julian froze. His heart stopped, then lurched into a frantic, uneven beat. He turned back slowly. Marcus Thorne was sitting in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the room, shadows obscuring his face. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. "It's a beautiful book, isn't it, Julian?" Marcus said, his voice a low, prowling drawl. "I spent a lot of time on the calligraphy. It's a shame no one will ever read it." Julian stepped back, the ledger feeling like a lead weight. "I have everything, Marcus. The bribes, the offshore accounts. It's over." Marcus stood up, the light finally hitting his face. He wasn't angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher watching a favorite student fail a simple test. "Did you really think I'd leave the most incriminating evidence in my life behind a false shelf you knew about? Did you think I was that sloppy?" He took a slow sip of his drink. "That ledger isn't a record of my crimes, Julian. Look at the handwriting again. Look at the ink." Julian looked down, his eyes scanning the pages with a sudden, sickening clarity. The handwriting. It wasn't Sarah's. It wasn't Marcus's. It was his own, or a perfect imitation of it. Every bribe, every illegal transaction was written in Julian's precise, Harvard-educated script. "I didn't bribe Sarah, Julian," Marcus said, stepping closer. "You did. At least, that's what the records show. That ledger is the final piece of the puzzle I've been building for 3 years. It doesn't clear you. It convicts you. It's the confession you left behind before you took your own life." Julian felt the world tilt. The triumph he had felt seconds ago turned into a cold, suffocating dread. He hadn't found the evidence to save himself. He had walked right into the heart of the frame. He tried to drop the book, but his fingers felt frozen, locked around the leather. "And David?" Marcus added, his smile widening. "Poor, broken David. He's currently sitting in the back of a van, realizing that the vendetta he was pursuing was just another narrative I fed him to keep him moving in the right direction. He was never your ally, Julian. He was your escort to the gallows." Marcus pulled a small, matte black handgun from his waistband. "Now, give me the book. We have a suicide note to finish." Julian didn't move. He couldn't. The weight of the betrayal was a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. He was trapped in a library of blank books, holding his own death warrant, staring down the barrel of a gun held by the man he had once called a friend. "The count, Julian," Marcus whispered. "Give me the book on 12. 1, 2, 3. The silence of the library was thick, a heavy blanket that muffled the thumping bass of the gala below. Julian watched Marcus's finger tighten on the trigger. He wasn't counting anymore. He was calculating. "You're not going to kill me, Marcus," Julian said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Not yet. You need the drive. You know I didn't bring it in here." Marcus paused, the hammer of the gun halfway back. "The drive is a nuisance, Julian. A digital ghost. This ledger, however, this is physical. This is what the jury will hold in their hands." "Then let's talk about the math," Julian said, stepping sideways, his eyes darting to the heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. "You have one gun. I have the ledger. If you shoot me, The blood will ruin the pages. The forgery won't hold up under forensic analysis if it's soaked in the victim's DNA. Marcus laughed, a sharp, barking sound that had no humor in it. You always were obsessed with the details. But you're forgetting the most important variable. I don't need the whole book. I just need your signature on the last page. He lunged forward, the gun swinging toward Julian's head. Julian didn't wait. He threw the heavy leather ledger at Marcus's face, a desperate, clumsy projectile. Marcus flinched, the book clipping his shoulder and thudding to the floor. Julian scrambled for the fire extinguisher. He yanked it from the wall, the cold metal biting into his palms. Marcus recovered, his face twisted in a mask of predatory rage. He leveled the gun. Last mistake, Julian. Thwip. A dart hissed through the air, burying itself in the mahogany shelf inches from Julian's ear. It wasn't a bullet. It was a tranquilizer. What the? Marcus started, but he was interrupted by a sudden, violent crash. The library windows shattered inward as two figures in black tactical gear swung in on ropes. They didn't look like police. They looked like the identical guards from the driveway. Cold, robotic, and efficient. Secure the target, one of them barked. Julian didn't wait to see who the target was. He dived behind a heavy reading table just as the room erupted into chaos. Marcus fired his handgun, the reports deafening in the small space. The guards didn't flinch. They moved with a terrifying unison, their own weapons spitting silent, lethal darts. David! Julian screamed into his earpiece. David, are you there? Static. Then, a voice that wasn't David's. Mr. Miller is currently being processed, Mr. Vance. We suggest you stay where you are. This is a private matter for the board. Julian realized the truth then. The security team David had hired hadn't just been bought out by Marcus. They were the board's own cleaners. They weren't here to save him or arrest Marcus. They were here to erase the entire mess. He saw Marcus ducking behind the desk, his face pale with shock. The predator had become the prey. The board was tired of the risk, tired of the scandal. They were opening the garbage chute for both of them. Julian looked at the fire extinguisher in his hands. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a team. He had a pressurized tank of chemicals and a desperate plan. He crawled toward the library's main electrical panel, tucked behind a velvet curtain. He could hear the guards moving through the room, their boots crunching on the broken glass. Thorne is down, one of them shouted. Find Vance. Julian reached the panel. He didn't know the code, but he knew the physics. He slammed the base of the fire extinguisher into the main breaker, a spark erupting as the metal connected with the high-voltage lines. The lights died. The library was plunged into a stinking, ozone-filled darkness. The electric drone of the insects outside seemed to swell, a wall of white noise that drowned out the shouts of the guards. Julian moved by touch, counting the paces to the service door behind the history section. 1, 2, 3. He reached the handle and pulled. He was in the service corridor, a narrow, dimly lit throat that smelled of damp concrete. He ran, his lungs burning, his mind racing. He needed to get to the ballroom. He needed a witness. He burst through the service doors and into the chaotic swirl of the gala. The guests were still dancing, oblivious to the violence occurring just a few dozen feet away. The music was a physical weight, a thumping rhythm that masked the sound of his ragged breathing. He saw her then, Jennifer Martinez, the detective with the ink-stained fingers. She was standing by the bar, her eyes scanning the room with a tired, determined squint. She was humming something, a low, mournful tune. Nearer, my God, to thee. Julian sprinted toward her, weaving through the dancers. Detective, Martinez! She turned, her hand moving toward her holster. "Vance, what the hell are you doing here?" "The library," Julian gasped, grabbing her arm. "Marcus, the board. They're killing each other." Before she could respond, the ballroom doors burst open. Christopher Brown, the hitman with the barcode tattoo, stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his motorcycle gear anymore. He was in a tuxedo that fit him like armor. He leveled a silenced pistol at Julian. "Down!" Martinez screamed, tackling Julian to the floor. The ballroom erupted. Screams shattered the music as the socialites realized the party was over. Martinez returned fire, her service weapon a thunderous roar compared to the hitman's silent sting. Julian scrambled toward the stage, where the gala's audio system was housed. He reached into his lapel and pulled out the small transmitter David had given him. It wasn't just a radio, it was a bridge. He plugged it into the main console, his fingers moving with a surgical precision born of 1,000 late-night coding sessions. "What are you doing?" Martinez shouted over the gunfire. "I'm changing the math," Julian yelled back. He flipped a switch, and suddenly, the ballroom was filled not with music, but with a voice. Marcus's voice. "Well, the suicide note is already sent to the press, Julian. The room is rigged to look like a tragic ending for a disgraced executive. I didn't bribe Sarah. You did. At least, that's what the records show." The recording Julian had captured in the library played through the massive speakers, the confession echoing off the walls like a divine judgment. The investors froze. The guards hesitated. Even Christopher Brown paused, his robotic expression flickering with a moment of confusion. The truth was out. It wasn't a digital file or a forged ledger. It was a voice, raw and arrogant, broadcast to the very people Marcus had spent his life manipulating. The police burst through the main entrances, led by a team of federal agents. They didn't go for Julian. They went for Marcus, who was being dragged from the library, his face a mask of bloody desperation. They went for the board members sitting in the VIP lounge. They went for the hitman, who dropped his weapon and raised his hands, his mismatched socks the only color in the gray light of the arrest. Julian stood on the stage, the heavy scent of perfume and ozone filling his lungs. He looked at Martinez, who was holstering her weapon, her face a mix of exhaustion and respect. "You got him, Vance," she said, her voice a low murmur. "But you're still going to have to answer for the rest of it." "I know," Julian said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver thumb drive. He handed it to her. "Everything is in there, the real math." As the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, casting a pale, cold light over the estate, Julian Vance walked out of the ballroom. He didn't count the stairs. He didn't look back at the empire he had helped build and then destroyed. He walked down to the beach, the sand cold and damp beneath his shoes. The waves crashed against the shore, a heavy, rhythmic thumping that drowned out the sirens and the shouts. He stood at the water's edge, watching the orange glow of the morning sun hit the horizon. He was a man without a career, without a fortune, and with a long road of legal battles ahead of him. But as he breathed in the salt air, he felt something he hadn't felt in 38 years. He felt stable. The count was over. The game was finished. Julian Vance was finally, for the first time in his life, exactly where he was supposed to be. He watched the tide wash away his footprints in the sand, a clean slate for a man who had finally learned that the only numbers that truly mattered were the ones you didn't have to hide.